Hey guys, it's Selwen here, and we have now reached the tanks on this ranking series, and like the melee and the ranged, we're gonna talk about the specs that are the most fun and most well-rounded designs in BFA, so basically rank them in order of gameplay. Now before going further, let's talk about the big changes that affect all tanks on this list. The big one that you're gonna notice is the threat nerf. In Legion, threat generation was about 10 to 20 times more than a DPSer. As tanks generally do much less damage than a DPS, you need to bump those numbers high, so you can actually maintain mobs on you. But in BFA, that was nerfed to only generate 4 times more threat than the DPS. What does that mean? Well, it will depend on your spec and what type of player you are. In single target, you're not gonna notice much of a difference, unless there's this super OP guy with you that just opens with huge burst and you this slowly pleb in weak gear. You're not gonna notice much. Plus, will also mean using your damaging abilities properly will be more important than in Legion. That said, again, in single target, not much of a difference. In AoE, that's where you will notice a bit more, but again, depending on your spec. If you are a tank like Blood or Vengeance, which have really strong AoE abilities that are practically constant, you're not really gonna lose aggro if using them correctly, that is. For other specs like the Protection Warrior, where your AoE is based on these short cooldown abilities and you just smash your keyboard, you might sometimes lose aggro against a good DPS. So you're gonna have to take turns on your targets and really use your AoE abilities well. So you might start seeing some messages saying losing a threat on some targets, so you're gonna have to be more alert and making sure you are dealing decent damage to all targets. But for the most part, it's fine. It will depend on how you play, so don't worry, it's not the end of the world. This is mostly preventing, for the most part, the kiting shenanigans in Mythic Plus, where you just use a single AoE ability like Blood Boil and just start kiting mobs around without losing any aggro. So things like that is where you're gonna notice the difference. So don't be surprised to see tanks in BFA doing those huge pulls and bunch of mobs start attacking the DPS or even the healer midway, since they didn't get the threat memo. The other big change is the global cooldown. In Legion, they were mostly absent on things like cooldowns and defensives. In BFA, not as much. So don't be surprised to see your CD now on a global cooldown, and sometimes your mitigation abilities, although the line there is rather thin, as something like Ignore Pain on the Warriors is on a global cooldown while Shield Block is not. So check the links down below in the description to know which abilities are now on the global cooldown change. Mitigation has also been changed for all tanks in effort of the tank's homogenization, as now all mitigation is based on armor like Iron Fur, Demon Spikes, or even Shield of the Righteous, which together also scale with your main stat like Strength or Agility. Magical damage is something that is also more dangerous to tanks overall, as a lot of magic defensives have been removed or nerfed. And finally, there's the stat squish and the removal of your artifact traits, so say goodbye to all the millions of hits and damage coming your way. All of that said, let's get started. The Guardian Druid. Guardian in BFA hasn't changed much, and by that I mean at all. The only changes that we got, besides the removal of traits and artifact ability, which is the case for most specs, is the changes to Iron Fur to scale with Agility, Frenzied Regeneration to have 2 charges and an increased cooldown, a Mangle to give 8 Rage up from 5, and Thrash 5 up from 4. You also get a CC now, but that's across Druid specs, so not a lot. Well, you do get the new bear form animations, at least walking animations. Now the reason why it's here isn't because of that, it still is a good tank, solid one at that. It's just that in terms of gameplay can be overly simple, which again can be good. It's an excellent tank for anyone to just pick up and go. Your gameplay mostly consists of 2 main abilities, a Mangle and Thrash, both in AoE and single target, with the occasional Moonfire proc, which you still feel kinda obligated to take on talents in most situations, and of course the Mangle proc as well, the core proc. That said, the boosts to the rage provided does help making your gameplay a little bit faster. But then you just spend on Iron Fur's rage to mitigate damage, and that's it. On talents, again, not much has changed. Guttural Roars was removed because apparently Stampeding Roar is too OP, and was a fun thing that Guardian provided at least more easily than now, but is now replaced with Tiger Dash, which is just a super sprint. Other changes are just minor on proc chances, such as Galactic Guardian from 7 to 5%. So overall, again, Guardian still is what it was in Legion, minus the traits and the artifact ability. It will be missed because it was a fun cooldown, but still is that very simple tank. You get this simple mitigation ability and all of them procs that can keep you decently engaged, but doesn't really bring anything overly interesting, so on that it takes this low spot. Next, we get the Protection Paladin. Like Guardian, is another very simple tank to play. Now, you can do more here, and that's why it takes the higher spot, and more changes came to Protection, mostly to fix the spammy nature of it, because in Legion that's mostly what you had, a whack-a-mole, a stand of play, a click all the things and stuff happens. In BFA, not as much. So for one, your Shield of the Righteous now grants armor, plus cleaves all around, which is really cool, so kinda works now as an AoE ability as well. But the overarching change to your gameplay was to your Consecration. In Legion was just another button for you to smash, plus granted benefits to increase your healing from Light of the Protector, make your Armor of the Righteous cleave, plus you could have multiple versions of them placed for more damage. But now no longer increases the healing on the Light of the Protector, and you can only place one. Plus, to make it more interesting or valuable, your Mastery grants a damage reduction buff while you stand within it. Basically what it means is that it will open up a global cooldown window in your gameplay, even though in your muscle memory you're still gonna be clicking that Consecration, but as long as you stand on and it's up, you don't need to. Now this change is an effort to fix an awful change to Protection, which I'm gonna talk about after. Avenger's Shield now also gets an extra buff, increasing the effectiveness on your next Shield of the Righteous, kinda like the Judgment trait that we had. So something else for you to maximize to increase damage and mitigation. Your Avenging Wrath now also increases healing, damage and crit by 20% instead. Now the awful change I talked about is that Light of the Protector is on a global cooldown. This has been very controversial among the Protection Paladins and isn't without reason. The main argument against this change was simply because Light of the Protector is a very reactive type of ability, as in there are moments where you want to use it as fast as possible after a surprise hit or a dip in your HP, and with the global cooldown makes it rather difficult. Not only that, when you take the talents, it becomes an ability to off-heal, which added some spice to the spec and made it more unique. Now is more of a nuisance. That said, it was boosted as now grants 200% more healing based on your missing HP. Understand now why Consecration was changed? The Blizz way to fix this issue was simply to reduce our global cooldown windows in terms of sheer abilities that we click at any given point, but doesn't really fix the underlying issue, now does it? Now talents got some changes as well. On the first tier we now get Redoubt. Avenger's Shield now passes to one additional target, plus increases your block by 75%. Now that's not a chance to block, it's just how powerful it is in terms of how much damage it reduces. So it's 75% more powerful than you currently reduce. Consecrated Ground now makes your Consecration 15% larger and adds a slow to it. All the rest is the same, besides small number changes. So overall, Protection Paladin gains some things, like your general gameplay can feel better in terms of you no longer that spammy nonsense type of playstyle, but the Light of the Protector global cooldown does hurt the spec. Among other GCDs like Seraphim can make it feel slower, but overall I do feel it's better in comparison to Legion. Our mitigation feels stronger as well, since it's now armor, while maintaining that easy playstyle of anyone can pick it up and do well, like the Guardian Druid. Just slightly more complex on your mitigation in comparison. The Blood Decay. I'm just so depressed at the Blood Decay in BFA. In Legion was such a fun and powerful tank, some might argue OP, but I have great memories of it, like soloing bosses when all of your group dies, never gets old. It was fast, reactive with his mitigation, and the only drawback really was the mobility, but you made it up in sheer power and was absolutely amazing for dungeons with your grips and the leech buff. And now just feels like a shell of its former self. So what has changed? Well, in general, it's just feeling super slow. It just doesn't do what you want it to do. In Legion was perfectly smooth. You built and mitigated the damage perfectly. You could do things like pulling runic power for later use, all this kind of decision making. Now you just constantly starved for resources, which makes all of your rotation extremely slow in comparison, and all the planning thing less meaningful, or well, less doable. Now that said, a part of this is of course gear. We need our haste, but even so it might not fix it, simply due to how our secondary stats work in BFA and of course the minor changes that are in place. But taking that aside, what are those baseline changes? Well, Bone Shield is now based on armor as well, Dancing Rune Weapon got its cooldown reduced to 2 minutes, and we got a new ability, Death's Advance, as our new mobility ability to increase our movement speed and make us immune to knockback. However, Wraithwalk is now a talent. Speaking of which, talents is another place where Blood got screwed over. In the first tier, we now get Rune Strike, which was basically our blood tap of Legion, but it's a damaging ability now. It grants a rune when you use, and its cooldown gets reduced by runes spent. It's alright, it does what it does and helps on how starved we are of resources, but the other choices can be arguably better, and it's a weird choice to make. A rapid decomposition no longer grants death and decay runic power over time, so again it hurts our resources. Instead, it just increases how fast it deals damage. On top, you get Blood Plague on there as well. Hemostasis? Each enemy hit by Blood Boil increases the heal of your next Death Strike, which is good, basically our Lego shoulders, sort of. Then you also get Consumption, and here it's just boring. I mean, what made Consumption interesting in Legion was the trait that gave Leech to our party. On itself, as an ability, it was okay, but it was free on the artifact, so whatever. But the leech buff provided was not only interesting, but also pretty powerful when you knew when to use it. Now, you just take it for damage, but we don't really need it. Sure, it's good burst heal in dungeons or AoE, but doesn't really make sense now. Here, some talent shuffling. Rune Tap is now better placed along with Anti-Magic Barrier and Will of the Necropolis. Rune Tap is always super good as an extra mitigation if you so need. Grip of the Dead is just a slow to your death and decay, and now decays over time. And you get your Wraithwalk here as well, and your cooldown reduction on your grips. Blood Worms was boosted to now heal for 15% of your missing HP, which is fine, but still pretty unreliable way to self-heal. But Ferocious is here, which is pretty cool. After you deal a Death Strike, you gain 15% leech, basically meaning that after each Death Strike, you're just gonna self-heal for 15% of all the damage that you do, including subsequent Death Strikes. So there's some pretty cool things you can do with it. But it's in the last tier where the real shit show starts. Red Thirst. Now, I get why it's a last tier talent. It could be seen as quite OP in Legion, and kinda was. But the problem of it being in this tier, it's quite simple. Bone Storm, for an example, is just mostly a damage option for AoE. I really like it as it grants me a lot of damage and burst both in damage and in heal, so has its niche. Okay, fair enough, but Purgatory is a type of talent you want to take when you go into dangerous or unknown situations. So it could be either a raid that you are progressing or a really tough dungeon that might get really tough and essentially will forgive you a mistake, some ability you weren't expecting, a mistaunt, a bad handling of a certain mechanic, whatever. Purgatory saves you from that, gives you a life insurance. Now Red Thirst is taken for pure survivability for the most part. You're gonna get vampiric blood quite often, so it's gonna offer that same safety in a way. So once you pass the phase that you use Purgatory, which is very useful when you are progressing and stuff, you're really not gonna need Red Thirst, are you? Sure, it's gonna be useful, but not as much. Now, it still is an awesome talent, it's just the tier that is on, it just kinda sucks. So all in all, Blood is just feeling worse altogether. It's slower, clunkier in its Death Strike uses, and the talents are not as good anymore. Removal of traits also hurt us a lot, but you can say that about every other tank spec. Now, it is still playable, and really great in dungeons still on the sheer control with your grips, which even there feels clunkier as Death Grip has a very short global cooldown. So on that, on the control, the fun things that you can still do with your CDs like Dancing Rune Weapon and still Vampiric Blood in a way, makes it so that it passes the Guardian Druid, but barely, which is just sad. You can still be powerful, your AoE and damage again is still really good, it just feels so much lesser than the Legion version and clunkier. The Protection Warrior. Protection went through big sweeping changes that for the most part just went around in this big circle in BFA's beta and alpha, to ended up in basically the same place as it plays in Legion, and like the Paladin where you gained some things but lost some others, but for the most part it's fine. So baseline changes, there's your shield block, costing a 30 rage now. Ignore Pain not only is now on a global cooldown, making your overall gameplay feel slower and slightly clunkier in comparison. Shield block is out of it, by the way, but now works slightly differently and is also a bit weaker. Now, Ignoring Pain ignores up to 50% of the damage on that shield absorb thing. Again, weaker, but works mostly the same, just that global cooldown makes it feel worse, but we're gonna have to get used to it. Spell Reflect is slightly weaker also. Demoralizing Shout is now on a 45-second cooldown instead of 1.5 minutes. Avatar is your new cooldown, replacing Battle Cry to increase your damage done and generates 20 rage. Intimidating Shout makes a return, I believe. I don't think we had it in Legion, I haven't played live in a while. It's just a fear/CC. And Shockwave is now baseline and only available on Protection. A great change overall since you took it practically all the time on your talents, at least in dungeons. On talents, big changes came as well. Into the Fray is now where it's still granting haste, but it is based on friendlies or enemies, so it's far more valuable to keep that buff up. Punish increases shield slam damage by 20% and adds a debuff increasing damage taken by 3%. And there's your Impending Victory heal now here as well. Dragon Roar is now here for protection, just an extra AoE ability to grab aggro and granting 10 rage. Unstoppable Force is quite cool, making your avatar more interesting while it's up, gonna increase Thunderclap damage by doubling it, hitting quite hard, and decreases the CD by 50%. Becoming usable every other GCD, basically granting a lot of AoE bursts. Combine this with Anger Management for faster avatars and you're gonna have really juicy AoE damage in dungeons, and really fun to do as well, even though that you're just smashing 2 buttons. Then here, Indomitable to give a flat 10% HP increase, Never Surrender, you know all about it, and Bolster to also make another CD more interesting, this time on Last Stand, which now will block all melee attacks while it's up, plus reduces its CD by 1 minute. Again, taking Anger Management, with this you're gonna get a lot of Last Stands to use, which again you can take advantage not just on the HP increase but on the blocks. Then here you get C, want to improve your Intimidating Shout to just make mobs cower instead of fleeing, which is really good for dungeons as you can use this as a way to AoE interrupt any sort of ability if they are CCable, and Rambling Earth to reduce the Shockwave CD much like it did in Legion. Then on this tier you know all about, Devastator is still good, but remember it's only usable once you get decent haste values. Anger Management you know all about and combines great with his other CD talents like Booming Voice, the Unstoppable Force, and even bolster, but especially on avatars, which is so fun. So overall, protection is like the decent tank on the list. It does what you need it to do and can deal with practically any situation. It's the well-rounded tank. It isn't as fast as a Legion version, nor it feels as powerful with the ignore pain changes, and doesn't even feel as powerful as the next tanks on the list, but still feels pretty good. Not great, nor bad, just good. In comparison to the others like the Paladin, I think it offers more interesting things like talents and cooldowns, and in general how your mitigation works and the way you deal damage and how you manage all of that. So on that, it deserves the middle place. The Brewmaster Monk. The Brewmaster always been the most unique tank that usually rewards high levels of play. It's not for everybody, and even though I personally love it mechanically, I just cannot get behind due to its aesthetics and theme and all of that, just like the Windwalker Monk, but for the most part here in BFA it still is playing amazingly. Yes, you did lose some things like all the classes and specs, but your combo play with your Blackout combo talents, the way your mitigation works with Stagger and the Bruise, and the small changes added still makes for one of the most engaging and fun tanks to play. Not only that, but powerful if you know what you're doing. So baseline changes, Breath of Fire dots on Keg Smashes now grant that 5% damage reduction buff that came from traits, which keeps a Breath of Fire more meaningful. Iron Skin Brew had its cooldown reduced to 14 seconds and the duration increased by 1 second, and don't be alarmed that you're not seeing the percentage of stagger increased. It still is the same as in Legion, pretty much. It was stated on the blue post. The same thing happens to the cooldown of your Purifying Brew, plus the stagger cleared is at 50% instead of 40. Stagger now also scales with agility, again all the homogenization that I talked about earlier, and the magical effectiveness is at 35% instead of 40%, and Leg Sweep has been moved to baseline just like Shockwave and is a great change overall. Those bruise changes, so your active mitigation for the most part, makes your overall use of them slightly easier, especially for newcomers. On talents, some new things as well. Spitfire is a pretty fun new one, adding a proc for your Breath of Fire to reset the CD on Tiger Palms at 25% chance, really fun for dungeons and really good damage when you get some decent procs out of it. Blackhawk's Brew had its cooldown slightly increased to 2 minutes, but remember you don't need it as much since the Brew's CDs are now reduced. Bob and Weave comes from a Lego, I think, to increase stagger duration by 3 seconds, pretty good also, and on the last tier the new one is Guards, which makes a comeback. Guards against future attacks for a portion of the damage that otherwise would be staggered to prevent entirely. So another great mitigation ability that you can use, and if you know when to use it, it's gonna do wonders. Blackout combo changed a bit as well. The damage increase on Tiger Palms was nerfed to 100% and no longer you get that Purifying Brew bonus, which is fine. It wasn't that great anyway and actually makes it better as you no longer have to fear that you're gonna consume the buff on it. All in all, Brewmaster is probably by far the most interesting tank mechanically. The most unique, but also the most complex, which isn't gonna work for everybody. It still feels pretty good, some might argue that is worse than in Legion, but your brews are still fun and make sense. The addition back to Guard is great, and even your Breath of Fire proc is fun for just more damage in dungeons. Brewmaster just feels like it can do everything as well. You have a great mobility, CC, decent control, damage, some self-heal as well, and mitigation while maintaining the sort of playstyle that can be again quite complex, but on the hands of good players can offer amazing results. And finally, we get the Vengeance Demon Hunter, and this is by far feeling like the most fun tank to play in BFA. Not only is it really strong, but offers great gameplay as well. It's not as complex as, say, the Brewmaster, it's actually quite simple, but taking everything in consideration, it can be arguably more enjoyable. All in all, we get a lot of changes as well. Baseline ones, we now get a Purge, which is just amazing to have as a tank called Consume Magic, which is using the old Interrupt name, which is now called called Disrupt. Demon Spikes changed to now grant armor based on agility and give a 15% chance to parry, and this is out of the global cooldown. Your Mastery again now grants armor to your Demon Spikes based on agility. Your Metamorphosis no longer empowers shear, but your Soul Fragments, which is your main mitigation to self-heal, now the heal itself is based on the damage taken in the last 5 seconds, much like the Blood Decays that strike works, making them more powerful if you use them right. Your shear on itself now always shatters one lesser soul fragment, and no longer on a chance, which is great also, so no more RNG nonsense. So you get more fragments overall, and your soul cleave now only consumes 2 fragments, which can feel like a nerf, but you can manage your fragments better this way without going up and down with the same fragments. Now talents is where even better changes came to Vengeance. Chariot Flash is the new one, well, was a trait to make your fiery brand increase the fire damage done to the target. Combines pretty well with Burning Alive to spread still. Fiery brand is on a global cooldown now though. Your Soul Rending has changed a bit to grant 5% leech permanently and 25% while in meta. Now Fracture suffered heavy changes as well, and in Legion was your way to make your Spirit Bombs work for the most part. But now Fracture replaces Shear entirely to grant 25 pain and then always grant 2 Soul Fragments. So just a more powerful Shear overall, but has a short cooldown on 2 charges, which is so short you never really can have downtimes with it anyway, and the charges allows you to enter this sort of maximizing mentality if you so wish. This change also makes you far less cluttered in comparison to Legion. It can feel more streamlined for sure, but personally feels smoother and more engaging overall. Then you get Gluttony, which was a very fun trait, and it sucks that you have to take a talent to pick it again, but hey, such is the way of BFA's class design. Spirit Bomb still great as ever for AoE/dungeons, but slightly nerfed on the heal provided on the frailty debuff at 10% now, but also costs pain, but is completely fine since you really need it for it to use pain since Fracture generates it, so the only way for you to dump pain is through Soul Cleaves or Spirit Bombs. Void Reaver is also a new one, a simple one to add a damage reduction of 6% on all targets hit by Soul Cleave, but is easy to keep up since it lasts for 8 seconds. So even if you're doing dungeons with a Spirit Bomb, you can easily just within a Soul Cleave just to add that debuff, especially when you don't need the safety that Dark Resort provides, much like Purgatory on the Blood Decays, or the Soul Barrier, which is great especially against magic and works really good now, especially with the new Fracture, but can reduce your overall damage since you are using your fragments on just mitigation welded shield instead of using on a Spirit Bomb or Soul Cleaves. So you're just gonna take it when you see that you're really gonna need it. Overall, your talent tree is great. There's tons of choices here to make if you're wanting damage or just be super defensive or anything in between. Something to be covered in future guides in BFA, as it's too much cover here on this ranked video. All of that said, Vengeance is just feeling amazing in BFA. It's one of the few tanks where it just feels better. Yes, some traits hurt to lose, but overall gameplay is the most interesting and engaging. The way your damage and mitigation is molded together makes it even more fun, and yes, part of it is that it feels quite powerful now. Most likely the most powerful of all the tanks. And yes, that adds to it, for sure, but I don't think anyone can deny that as a tank, it just feels right, especially in this BFA world. So guys, that covers my ranked tank video. Just one more left, which is now the healers. Just like the ranged and melee ones, you once again gonna find the faults of BFA class design, but among it you can find some gems like Vengeance or even the Brewmaster, so it's not just warlocks and warriors. Anyway guys, that covers everything. Remember to comment on what you think are the best tanks in BFA, either if you are playing the beta or you are playing the pre-patch in the future, and as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to get more videos like this, and check out my Patreon if you wish to support the channel. Have a fantastic day everyone, and I will see you all next time. See ya!